Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and with me is Aware's favorite Republican, Ed Mandel. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, September 17th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. We argue that Trump is not the problem, U.S. war-making is. The Democrat Party thinks it can win the 2020 presidential election, no matter how ridiculous its presidential candidates are. Listen to Joe Biden a little bit. By demonizing President Trump and running against him as a racist. He's certainly giving them plenty of help. But what the Democrats are desperate to have triumph are the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that have characterized all administrations for 40 years. More war and more war provocations versus Russia and China to retard the economic integration of Eurasia, a threat to the world economic domination of the U.S. 1%. But of course, the Democrats can't admit that that's their goal. Only the Republicans probably can. So they lie about hope and change while continuing neolib and neocon policies, more war and more austerity. There is one anti-war candidate in the race, and as far as I can tell, only one, and that's Tulsi Gabbard. The question of Tulsi is concerning a lot of people, including our own chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson. He suggests that Tulsi is not quite what she seems if we suggest she's an anti-war candidate. He points to an interview with CBS where the interviewer asks Tulsi Gabbard, the representative, congressional representative from Hawaii and apparently the only anti-war Democratic candidate. They asked Tulsi whether earlier this month you told our political reporter that you would support the Democratic nominee if you end up not winning the primary. Is there any policy a Democratic nominee could hold that would persuade you not to elect them in the general election? He's obviously asking about the fact that all the other Democratic candidates are some version of pro-war. They support to some extent the 8 wars which Donald Trump inherited from President Obama and the continuation of the belligerent policies around the world. Our organization makes it clear that we think American troops and weapons should be withdrawn from the world at large. Gabbard answers to the question, is there any policy that could persuade you not to support a Democratic candidate? And Gabbard says, no, I am, as are all of the other candidates that I'm aware of running for president, committed to defeating Donald Trump in 2020. I look forward and hope to be able to earn that nomination myself, but if not, then I'll join with others in making sure that that happens. The reporter asked, will you ultimately support the Democratic nominee? Gabbard says yes. Our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, who never shared my enthusiasm for Gabbard, sends a comment from the late political philosopher B.B. King. The thrill is gone, the thrill is gone away, the thrill is gone, baby, the thrill is gone away. You know you done me wrong, baby, and you'll be sorry someday.
Oh boy.
Hey, look, we don't,
Okay, I got you.
we put all views on, right?
Singing it.
It's, and Jeff asks, so this is what it took, eh? That is, Gabbard saying she would support the nominee, whoever it is. He says, I can't say the thrill is gone for me, as I never had that thrill to start with. That is, support for Gabbard. And you can't lose what you never had. As you might have guessed, I looked on her candidacy as the latest in a line of Democratic Party shepherds, nothing more. Ultimately, I think he's referring to shepherd, sheepdog, the people who are keeping Democrats in line to the party nominee, regardless of peculiar ideas, say, opposition to war that they have. Ultimately, it's the neoliberal, neoconservative nature of that party that turned me off to all of its candidates, no matter how critical their speech occasionally became. This is Jeff Nicholson. I was mildly entertained to see her candidacy roll along, to watch other people's reactions to things she said, and to notice what they chose not to pay much attention to, such as Gabbard's interviews that got far too little review, like her 2018 Intercept interview, and her Primo Nutmeg interview. Hey, you got to look for these things, come on, where she stands by the same pro-war views. To me, it's all part of the reason the largest segment of the registered U.S. voters chose to stay home, as they say, and not vote for U.S. president at all. The range, and he's referring to 2016, the range of allowable debate the major parties will tolerate is so narrow and basically all structured to benefit the elites that it's not worth the effort of picking one of the major party candidates over the other. Most people don't research third-party and independent candidates, which is silly not to. There's a good deal more of what Gabbard has said that people are taking exception to.
Actually, for me, voting for a third-party candidate was extremely important to my life when I voted for Ross Perot. So it was actually a life, at least for me personally, was a life-changing moment. So I mean, whatever, from before and after. So, but I do appreciate the fact that most people do not want to feel as if they're throwing their vote away by voting for a third-party candidate, which doesn't make any sense. When you vote, you want to vote for someone you believe in. So I don't understand.
Exactly.
I never understood the concept of throwing your vote away. I guess the idea is you don't want to be, the person who voted, the one vote. If one candidate wins by one vote, and you're the one who made the difference, I guess, or something. I don't know, or somehow. I mean, I don't know if I agree with Jeff about Tulsi being a shepherd. I mean, I don't know. I don't see her as being that role. There are other candidates who made the debate, who are allowed to speak in the debate, who are probably more likely to be considered shepherds than Tulsi. Tulsi, and that's the reason I think that's the real reason why she was not invited, actually, because she was breaking a hole into Kamala Harris's campaign or into her image, and they were fearful that if she were at the debate, she would have punched holes in other candidates.
I think you're right.
Specifically Elizabeth Warren, which would have really damaged them, because then, okay, now who do we have left? And they would have, and then, oh my goodness,
it was a classic takedown of Kamala Harris. I mean, and I think that one comment in that second Democratic debate essentially destroyed Kamala Harris's candidacy.
Oh, absolutely.
It's quite remarkable.
Yes. I do believe, so maybe I'll just put this out there. I do believe that we're going into the future right now. Most of the candidates that are left, even including Tulsi Gabbard, I think she'll stay in the campaign. They'll all start collecting delegates going into the primary next in the next year with the Democratic election, and they're all going to nobody's going to reach the majority. And then when the superdelegates kick in on the second ballot, they'll choose Elizabeth Warren, I believe. I mean, that's probably what's going to happen. And even if Tulsi Gabbard, by some miracle, has the lead, it won't make any difference. She's not the one. It's the safe candidate, not Elizabeth Warren.
Well, she continues her assault on the war making of the U.S. government. She's a member of the military, an officer, the only one of all the people who are running on the Democratic ballot. She's the only one who actually is a member of the military.
I believe there's another candidate who was also, because they mentioned that debate, that there was another candidate who was also in the military.
Buttigieg
Yes.
was a member of the military,
Good.
and is the only veteran other than
Right.
Gabbard
Right.
in that Democratic lineup.
Right.
But he is on the record of supporting the war in Afghanistan. No question about that.
Okay.
Gabbard this week has once again suggested that if one is looking for any anti-war sentiment amongst the Democrats, and admittedly it's a difficult task, she might be the only one who can satisfy some of that. The account of her activities this week from Breitbart, of all places, gives us the most detailed account of what happened, which Breitbart deplores. The headline is, Tulsi Gabbard to Trump, "We are not your prostitutes, you are not our pimp."
Yep.
They picked out the vigorous language
that
Gabbard uses. Yep. She launched, according to Breitbart, she launched a profane attack. This is very nice of Breitbart being worried about niceties such as that. Okay. Launched a profane attack on President Donald Trump's foreign policy on Monday evening, denouncing the idea of defending Saudi Arabia. Now, this is all blown up in the wake of the attacks on the Saudi oil production facilities that caused a 20% jump in oil prices this week. So it's a serious business. And what Gabbard is responding to is the president's assertion that the attack on the Saudi oil fields was probably Iranian, was done by Iran, and that Iran should not expect to get away with the attack. That's what the
I also think
said.
that Trump has done something different from previous administrations.
Oh, that's true.
Because he's made us less dependent upon the oil. He's gone to the shale. I think the shale in North Dakota. We're not as incredibly dependent upon the oil, and because of that, we're less likely. That's the reason why you're seeing as being more anti-war than previous presidents, because we're not needing that oil to keep the flow of oil open. So I don't know if I agree with you completely or agree with Tulsi that he is their bitch, because I'm not going to use that word, but I'm saying that I just think that he's, how do I put this?
Well, there's several issues here.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And maybe we start with a basic one, the whole question of oil in the first place.
Yeah.
I think that we're somewhat behind the times if we think that the issue is America's access to oil, whether someone can deny American industry enough energy resources. That really has little to do, I think, with American policy on oil. U.S. has concluded for a long time that the principal reason to control world oil flows is to control countries and the economies of countries that depend upon that oil. The U.S. doesn't depend upon foreign oil. We have enough oil in the Western Hemisphere and in the Atlantic Basin, if you like, for our own needs easily and more. That's one of the reasons that the Venezuelan enormities are taking place. Venezuela is one of the principal sources of America's domestic oil, if you like, along with West Africa. We don't need Middle East oil and never have. The problem is the rest of the world does need Middle East oil, and the control of that oil, particularly oil from the Persian Gulf, gives the U.S. a whip hand over the economies of these potential enemies and restless friends, perhaps. That's the real concern that the U.S. has in regard to control of world oil supplies. It's not support for any of our domestic industry. By the way, that domestic industry we're offshoring very rapidly anyhow, and have been for 40 years. So. The world political concern for oil is a concern for the control of the world economy, which, after all, the U.S. has had since the Second World War, even though that control has declined in the years since the Second World War. But oil is a means, not an end. Oil is the lever that the U.S. uses to control the world economy, and that control is centered in part on control of the Persian Gulf. This is of long-term importance. The U.S. support for the racist state of Israel and for Israeli apartheid does not depend upon white supremacy, as we find some people who see themselves on the left saying these days, nor does it depend upon a particular commitment to racism and apartheid, which is a fundamental characteristic of the Israeli state. What it depends upon is that Israel is America's stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, the best way to continue that flow of energy resources out of the Persian Gulf. That's why the U.S. supports Israel, not because of any ideological conjunctions, particularly on racism, and therefore, until we pay attention to the American control of the worldwide economy, our protestations about the Middle East don't make a great deal of sense. It's the situation that the U.S. finds itself in in regard to its methods of controlling the worldwide oil economy, as we've seen just this last week when the enemies of Saudi Arabia, America's great friend, understand that there's a vulnerability in Saudi Arabia to that sort of attack.
So do you think that the Democratic Party is wary of Tulsi Gabbard because she would threaten the military-industrial complex?
Exactly.
And so that's why they're preventing her to go on stage, because because she can. I think she's actually the best communicator that the Democrats have.
I think you're probably right about that. Although
of all the candidates, she's also the most. She's also the one who behaves most presidential. If you actually look at our different interviews that she's had.
I particularly like the Breitbart article or account of her comments this week, because Breitbart so tightly represents the views of the American military-industrial complex, as you say. Gabbard this is the Breitbart account, Gabbard was responding to President Trump's statements about a potential U.S. response to a recent attack by Houthi rebels on oil fields in Saudi Arabia that threaten global oil supplies. I'm going to read it. It threatens the U.S. control of global oil supplies and the security of a key American ally, that is Saudi Arabia. American Middle East policy being based on the unlikely alliance of Saudi Arabia and Israel these days. In a video released on Twitter, Gabbard declared, quote, "Yesterday," this is Tulsi Gabbard's account, "Yesterday, President Trump offered to place our military, my brothers and sisters in uniform, under the command of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the dictator of the Islamic Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Trump said, quote, "We are locked and loaded, but are waiting to hear from the kingdom as to who they believe was the cause of this attack and under what terms we would proceed," close quote. "Mr. President," said Gabbard, "as you know, I have never engaged in hateful rhetoric against you or your family, and I never will, but you're offering our military assets to the dictator of Saudi Arabia to use as he sees fit is a betrayal of my brothers and sisters in uniform who are ready to give our lives for our country, but not for the Islamist dictator of Saudi Arabia. For you to think that you can pimp out our proud servicemen and women to the Prince of Saudi Arabia is disgraceful, and it once again shows that you are unfit to serve as our commander-in-chief. As a member of Congress and as a soldier, I and all of my brothers and sisters in uniform have taken an oath to protect and defend the American people and the Constitution of the United States of America. There is nothing in our Constitution that gives you the power to go to war without the express consent of Congress. But to speak of giving you the power to offer our military to a foreign power like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to use as they wish, President Trump, your words and actions are a betrayal of my brothers and sisters in uniform, the American people, and our Constitution. My fellow service members and I, we are not your prostitutes. You are not our pimp. Now, in spite of the inflamed language,
I will say the previous presidents have done really horrible indiscretions. I mean, Trump is. I mean, to isolate Trump and say that he is the first president to do this. No, I mean, I seriously disagree here.
No, the question is what's to be done next. Not that it's never been done before. The American attempt to control the world economy has always been surrounded by a bodyguard of lies of what the U.S. was actually doing at large. Take Afghanistan, for example. The U.S. account is that our military in Afghanistan are fighting terrorism. Now, that's false in terms of the origin of the American military presence in Afghanistan 18 years ago. It's also fault for the overall concern for Afghanistan that the U.S. government shows. The reason U.S. government is concerned about Afghanistan is that it represents a step towards that economic integration of Eurasia, the incorporation of Afghanistan into the Russian-Chinese alliance, the effective alliance that is controlling the economy of Eurasia these days, or is moving towards the control of the economy of Eurasia, and that the U.S. is pledged to stop it, or pledged to its own economic elite who thinks their own ability to exploit Eurasia is harmed by the Chinese and Russian activities there. The Belt and Road Initiative in China and the Russian involvement in its region are objects of American foreign policy opposition all along. Remember, we went into Afghanistan and after 2001 on the grounds that the person presumed responsible for 2001, that Osama bin Laden was there, and the U.S. demanded that Afghanistan turn him over. They didn't suggest that Afghanistan was responsible for the attack. They suggested the U.S. suggested Al-Qaeda was responsible for the attack, and the leader of Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. The government of Afghanistan says, okay, we will turn him over to you if you show us proof that he is indeed responsible for the attack on New York in 2001. The U.S. refused to produce that proof. There was a good reason for it. They didn't have any. Yes. The U.S. refused to produce that proof and instead invaded Afghanistan for not turning over Osama bin Laden. Most Americans don't recall that, but that was what was going on.
I think what's important here is to say that some of our foreign involvements right now were not Trump's.
Sure.
Were not the previous administrations created the situations.
Exactly.
Trump, unfortunately, is faced with this situation. What do I do at this point?
I think you're exactly right.
And that's very, very important because I mean, Tulsi Gabbard seems to be. She's projecting our current foreign policy situation completely on Trump's shoulders, and I'm not sure if he completely deserves that.
I agree with you on that point. I'm not sure that's what Gabbard is doing. What Gabbard is doing is talking specifically about this week's events, the attacks in Saudi Arabia, and the suggestion that that we're, quote, locked and loaded, ready to attack Iran or someone else in response to these attacks on Saudi Arabia. That's what she's objecting to. She actually has been quite clear about the general background of America's war on terrorism, and as I say, is the only presidential candidate who opposes military operations in this regard.
I mean, Carl, would I be strange in saying that compared to previous presidents, Trump sort of is more anti-war than the previous president, sort of?
That's unquestionably true, Ed. It seems to me we forget sometimes
By comparison.
that Trump became president
Yeah.
by by being the first major party presidential candidate in 40 years, actually to attack the neoliberal and neoconservative principles that had guided all previous administrations in that period, Republican and Democrat. He inherited, as I pointed out, 8 wars from Obama, and the situation was such that he prosecuted and continued those wars.
Yeah.
But any attempt to lessen them was rejected by the Trump administration, but they also did not expand them, and that's upset the American political establishment and fed into the Russiagate nonsense.
Oh yeah, Russia.
On their charge that Trump was doing Putin's business.
Absolutely.
This is all nonsense.
That whole narrative is ridiculous, and also it was even torn apart by progressives,
Exactly.
like Jimmy Dore, Glenn Greenwald,
Precisely
and,
right.
Aaron Mattei, and I mean these are so it wasn't just torn apart by conservatives; it was torn apart by the own. And well, I won't go into details now. I mean that whole thing is ridiculous. Yeah.
Back to Gabbard,
Yeah.
Representative Tulsi Gabbard was smeared as an Assad apologist,
Yes.
An apologist for the
Repeatedly,
ruler
yes.
of Syria, for her efforts to end the U.S.-backed proxy war and her skepticism of U.S. military strikes in Syria. The MIT professor Ted Postel, a leading missile expert and informal Gabbard advisor, defended Gabbard's stance. Postel also criticized the continued silence on a leaked document that suggests the April 2018 gas attacks in Syria was staged. Here is a transcript of a discussion of that by Aaron Mattei, who has been one of the leading critics of the entire Russiagate nonsense.
Yes.
Mattei says at the last Democratic debate, that means the last but one, Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard destroyed Kamala Harris' image as a progressive prosecutor by bringing up her actual record. Gabbard said, quote, to Kamala Harris, when you were in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, people she prosecuted, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who are on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology, close quote. Mattei said the responses of the Harris camp and its allies were not to defend Harris's actual record as a prosecutor. Instead, this group decided to smear Tulsi Gabbard as an apologist for Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad and a denier of his atrocities. That's what they said Tulsi did. This is not because of anything Gabbard has actually said or done. She's called Assad many times a brutal dictator. But this was because Gabbard has met with Assad in a bid to stop the U.S.-backed proxy war in Syria. And she's also raised questions about allegations against Assad of chemical weapons use, which were used to justify U.S. military strikes in 2017 and 2018. Gabbard might stand apart in Washington for doing this, but she has grounds for skepticism. Earlier this year, a leaked engineering assessment from the Organization of Chemical Weapons to undermine the UN Organization of Chemical Weapons, undermined the claim that Assad carried out a chemical weapons attack in the city of Douma in April 2018. The report concluded that gas cylinders found in the scene were manually placed, i.e. somebody set them there, suggesting that the attack was staged. Speaking to CNN, Tulsi Gabbard cited the leaked UN report. Quote, this is Gabbard, there was a report that was recently sent out from the OPCW, the UN organization responsible for investigating incidents of chemical weapons attacks, that brings into light a lot of different evidence that wasn't previously reported. And secondly, there's a professor from MIT who has been an expert in missile attacks and chemical weapons, who's also shed a lot of light on this. What I'm saying is we've got to examine all of the evidence, close quote. A radical position, of course, within the American Democrat Party. Mattei says, well, join me now as MIT Professor Gabbard cited, Theodor Postel, an award-winning professor of science, technology, and national security policy at MIT, and Postel affirms what Gabbard alone amongst the Democratic candidates was saying. This constitutes for the Kamala Harris forces a defense of a brutal dictator. And instead of answering Gabbard's charges about Kamala Harris as prosecutor, they said, well, of course, she's an apologist for terrorism. Gabbard is apologizing for the dictator of Syria. Well, this is all nonsense. The point is that Gabbard and none of the other Democratic candidates came to Gabbard's obvious defense, although several were happy to see Kamala Harris discomfited. The point is that Gabbard remains the only critic of American war in Syria and elsewhere amongst the supposed Democratic candidates.
There's a long line of presidents or presidential, I don't know about presidential candidates, but presidents meeting different dictators to have discussions, whether it's like FDR meeting Stalin or Richard Nixon going to China or obviously Trump going to North Korea. So I mean, it's better to have conversations rather than to wait until, having no conversations at all, wait until an active situation happens where everyone actually no military yet. No, so I mean, just meeting a person and talking with and community and attempting to find some sort of a communication or create some sort of I don't think that can be considered a bad thing. I mean, I don't understand. But I think obviously Kamala Harris was. Her campaign was her image was punctured. I guess she felt the need to counterattack.
It's really quite remarkable that the presidential campaign, the long suggested presidential campaign, is innocent, and a horrible use of the word, of any suggestion that the war is there's something wrong with the war on terrorism.
We have another half hour, by the way.
Gabbard is the one who's doing it.
Yep.
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a half hour left, and we'll be talking about some other aspects of the war and what's going on in this regard, not just in regard to the Democratic campaign, shocking as that may be. Yep. Up to you, Ed. Anything you want to move to? I want to talk about Saudi Arabia and the attacks and the potential for new war in the Middle East.
Well, I'm not sure it'll be obvious. Right now, the news. I was listening to BBC last night, and they were discussing was Netanyahu running for re-election in Israel. I don't know if you wanted to discuss that, but that's more or less just.
The election is going on while we're recording this particular program, and I'm sure we'll have an occasion to say something about it.
Let a future program.
What's impressed me about it has been the extent to which Netanyahu is willing to go in order to make sure that he is reelected. And it suggests that he's not at all sure that he will be reelected. So the jury is out in the truncated democratic structure of the State of Israel, the exclusion of many voters within the State of Israel is obvious.
Well, there seems to be a crisis among all candidates are never sure until the final tally is, or unless they count the votes. That's another issue.
We will talk about what happens in Israel when we know.
Yeah, I suppose.
It's bound up, of course, with American war making in the Middle East. Has always been so, and remains so to this day.
You can discuss it. Go ahead and discuss Saudi Arabia. That's a good thing.
The best thing I've seen on the attacks in Saudi Arabia and on the oil structure of Saudi Arabia and the potential for war that came out of that comes from Gary Brecker, who has a piece entitled "Please Don't Make Me Say Game of Drones." His point is,
no.
yes, I know, but his point is that the report has been that this vast damage that was done to Saudi Arabia oil refinery capacity was done by drone attacks. Brecker says, and I think he's right, we just experienced one of the decisive military engagements of the 21st century, the supposed drone attack on the huge Saudi oil facilities in Khurais and Abqaiq. The point here is not the nature of these attacks, but what they suggest, and more than suggest, about the vital to the U.S. control of Middle East oil through its allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel. At about 4 a.m. on September 14th, explosive carried by some sort of flying vehicle hit these two targets, which are 200 kilometers distant from each other. It was called a drone attack by Saudi media because the flying vehicles were apparently slow enough to be engaged by machine gun posts at the two targeted installations. This was a big attack, not a gesture or tour de force, but rather a strategic strike on the industry that is Saudi Arabia's only reason to cohere. This refers to the fact that the actual oil-producing region of Saudi Arabia is the eastern province that's in fact dominated by Shia, the branch of Islam strongly opposed by the right-wing branch of Islam, the Sunni or Wahhabi branch that controls Saudi Arabia. Brecker says something big happened here. It was a large-scale attack. There was clearly a swarm of missiles. The Saudis are admitting 17 impacts and are talking about a lot more near misses. That's a lot of hits. The effects were big and fast. Crude oil prices went way up, and the money guys were using the word game changer, a four-letter word in their dialect. In fact, the oil prices jumped 20% immediately after the attacks. Something big happened, that's clear. But there are problems with every part of this story as reported so far, starting with the drone emphasis. If, as Mike Pompeo has hinted several times, American Secretary of State, the attack was launched from Iran itself or Shia militia-controlled territory in southwest Iraq, the drone would have to travel something between 500 and 800 kilometers to hit Khurais and Abqaiq. Heck, Abqaiq and Khurais themselves are 200 kilometers distant from each other. Even a launch from the Iranian coast would be far beyond the estimated range of the Abd-el-Qasif, the main Iranian Houthi munition-carrying drone. The point is, these were not drone attacks. There was something else. Khurais is roughly 200 kilometers from the Saudi coast as the drone flies, and the Persian side of the Gulf is at least another couple of hundred kilometers wide at this point. So unless the Abd-el-Qasif, the drone, has been given the makeover of all time, it's got the perfect alibi, which makes me wonder why the first wave of stories about the attacks kept stressing drones. Why does it have to be drones? Why not simple ballistic missiles, variants of the Scud missile of yore? If you take your imaginary compass and draw a diameter of the range of Iranian-manufactured ballistic and cruise missiles, range is less of a problem. The familiar Iranian-designed surface-to-surface ballistic missiles, the Shahab-3, can be adapted to hit targets up to 2,000 kilometers distant. That could mean that the missiles were launched from Iran, as the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State claims. But it could also mean they were launched from Houthi territory in northwest Yemen, from Sana'a, the Houthi-held capital, to Khurais is 1,600 kilometers by road. Not that there's a lot of people making that commute these days, and a lot less if you're flying direct, as an airborne VBIED like the Shahab-3 would be doing. Even Abqaiq, near the Gulf, would be within the imaginary 2,000-kilometer zone, with Sana'a, the Yemen capital, at its center. Iran also has cruise missiles, which might, for all I know, be loud and slow enough to draw fire from machine gun posts in the facilities, and definitely have the range to hit Kuwait and Abqaiq from just about anywhere in the region, southern Iraq, Iran, or northwest Yemen. They may also have given some of these to their Houthi allies. I have no idea. It could have been those cruise missiles, loud, slow, and distracting, the guards were focusing on as the ballistic missiles came to the end of their long compass curve. Or there could have been drones in the air as pure distraction, launched from the Saudi desert of Shia cells, by Shia cells within the kingdom. The eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where Abqaiq, Kuwait, and the big oil fields are, is heavily Shia. And as I've written from experience, Shia of whatever variant are not very happy, ruled by Wahhabi bigots. That's an exercise in understatement. Nobody knows how many Shia live in Saudi Arabia, because only one sect is legal in the country, and Shia it most definitely is not. So the last people on earth who want you to know how many Shia live in the eastern province are the men of the Saud clan in Saudi Arabia. But even so, the anger of eastern province Shia sometimes gets loud and fierce enough to break the Saudi PR cone of silence, as when Shia clergy are beheaded for being Shia clergy. So it's possible there's a mix of tactics as well as weaponry involved here. Drones as distraction, launched from very near the target by sleeper cells, cruise missiles as distraction or low and slow stealth weapons, and Scud-style ballistic missiles. Whatever mix of weapons and tactics the attackers used, it worked, big time. But that should not have surprised anyone. It did, but it shouldn't have, especially anyone who listens to the program that produced this account, Radio War Nerd. We've said on the show over and over that Saudi Arabia can't fight a war with Iran because Saudi infrastructure is just too vulnerable, as fragile as a lunar colony, as a friend of the show put it. Right now, right on schedule, comes the low-tech attack on oil industry infrastructure in the eastern province. It was inevitable. Oil industry facilities are the easiest targets in the world. The two Saudi facilities that were hit are both huge targets, which means you don't need precision guiding to hit them. It's not easy to get accurate data on the size of these installations, but Abqaiq, the smaller one, has 44,000 residents and has to rank as one of the biggest and most vulnerable gated communities on Earth. What keeps all those people in the desert of the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is the money oil brings in. What keeps them alive is water, either trucked in by the bottle or sucked up from the Gulf by desalination plants. And the Houthi have already struck one of those desalination plants at the other corner of the kingdom. Which brings us back to where we started, which is, we told you so. Saudi Arabia cannot fight a war with Iran. We don't know, and in the event of a war it wouldn't even matter, where these attacks were launched from or precisely what weapons were used. The point, as we've been trying to say for some time, is that the Saudi invasion of Yemen is a debacle. War with Iran would be a debacle on a far grander scale. And all things considered, it might be easier for Pompeo to concede that Iran exists and that the Saud family to make Ashura an allowable public holiday. That's the Shia holiday. That's clear enough. What's much more interesting in this event is this event as a decisive moment in military history. There used to be jokes defining terrorism as violence by groups that don't have an air force. Well, now these groups do, the ones you might like and the ones you hate. How many F-16s does it take to cripple the Saudi infrastructure from the air? Answer, 0, because that's what Iran and the Houthi have just done. And the fulminations from the White House that Tulsi Gabbard was objecting to, the attempts to say from the American government, we have to wait and see what the Saudi Arabians what the Saudi Arabian government does in response to these attacks are, in fact, at best fulminations. There isn't anything that can be done. War with Iran would be possible only if the madness takes over in Washington, and a war which would lead to the destruction of the Saudi oil complex is being complicated. Even Trump isn't stupid enough to do that.
I don't think it's going to happen.
Big
I don't think Trump is that stupid.
Exactly. I think you're right.
I just don't think, and I don't think there's any history. In fact, I mean, even previous presidents had they used Iraq as the to fight Iran. I mean, that was way back in the '80s. But the idea of no president would directly fight Iran. I would otherwise. It would be a major problem.
But it suggests, once again, how inaccurate, not to put too fine a point on it, mainstream media accounts are of what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. When it's couched in terms of what's Trump going to decide, and has very little relevance to what's possible and what might occur as a result of the fulminations against Iran that we're hearing from Washington in general, and once again, without pinning it down on who's making those noises, because they're coming from the American political establishment, not specifically Donald Trump, who may, as you suggest, Ed, be smarter than he seems to be on what's going on here.
I think he's smarter than you're willing to give him credit for. But yeah, that's what I'm going to tell you. Despite the tweets.
You're watching Aware on the Air, the anti-war, anti-racism effort to talk about the real news that does not get through American mainstream media and American government posturing. One of the people who's been doing the best job of that, I think, recently has been the Australian commentator Caitlin Johnstone. She had a piece today that reflected on her role and on these activities. She says, I'm expected to write something about the U.S. government's warmongering against Iran over an attack on a Saudi oil refinery, because that's typically what I do in this ongoing improvisational exercise of mine. I write about the behavior of the U.S. war machine and the propaganda that is used to bolster it. It's what my readers have come to expect. But honestly, I find the whole thing extremely tedious, and I've been putting off writing about it for 2 days. This is because, from a propaganda analysis point of view, there's really not much to write about. The Trump administration has been making bumbling, ham-fisted attempts at manufacturing public support for increasing aggressions against Iran since it initiated withdrawal from the JCPOA, the nuke deal, a year and a half ago. Yet, according to a Gallup poll last month, Americans still overwhelmingly support diplomatic solutions with Iran over any kind of military aggression at all. She's one of the few people who's talking about this, because the mainstream media in general is crying up war against Iran, and as we were suggesting, that may be looked at askance from the White House. In contrast, most Americans support, in contrast with the current situation, most Americans supported a full-scale ground invasion of Iraq, according to Gallup polls taken in the lead-up to that 2003 atrocity. With the far less committed Libyan intervention, it was 47% supportive of military action versus 37% opposed. That's the kind of support it takes to get a U.S. war off the ground these days, and it's going to take a lot more than a busted Saudi oil refinery to get there, even if the completely unproven event that it was indeed Iran, in the completely unproven event that it was indeed Iran that launched the attack. Donald Trump says he's ready to back Saudi Arabia in conflict against Iran if U.S. concluded it was behind the oil plant attacks. The reason I'm able, writes Caitlin Johnstone, to spend so much time writing about war propaganda as part of my job is because war propaganda is happening constantly. And the reason war propaganda is happening constantly is because it's absolutely necessary for the perpetuation of the U.S. centralized empire's slow-motion Third World War against unabsorbed governments. In other words, the propaganda apparatus of the empire, empire centered, of course, in the United States, works constantly to manufacture consent for military aggressions because it absolutely requires that consent. It requires the consent of the American public, and that's why the American public has to be constantly misled by mainstream media. When I say that the imperial war machine requires public consent before it can initiate overt warfare, I'm not saying that the U.S. government is physically or legally restricted from launching a war that the public disapproves of. I'm saying that it's absolutely essential for the drivers of empire to preserve the illusion of freedom and democracy in America. People need to feel like their government is basically acting in everyone's best interest and that it's answerable to the will of the electorate. Otherwise, the illusion of freedom and democracy is shattered and people lose all trust in their government and media. If people no longer trust the political media class, they can't be propagandized. Without the ability to propagandize the masses, the empire collapses. So out of sheer self-interest, establishment power structures necessarily avoid overt warfare until they've successfully manufactured consent for it. If they didn't do this and chose instead to take off the nice guy mask, say, screw you, we're going to do what we want, and start butchering Iranians at many times the cost of Iraq in both money and in American lives lost, people would immediately lose trust in their institutions, and the narrative matrix which holds the whole thing together would crack open like an egg. From there, revolution would become an inevitability, as people are no longer being successfully propagandized by the establishment narrative managers into believing the system is working fine for everyone. This is Caitlin Johnstone pointing out the necessity for the U.S. government to maintain that public trust in the purposefulness of American foreign policy and American war making. She quotes Glenn Greenwald, the reporter, who tweets this week, "I can't believe that the U.S. intelligence community's accusations about a foreign adversary turned out to be not merely as reliable, certain, or definitive as they and the U.S. media originally depicted them to be. Is this the first time in history that this has happened?" She writes, "Think about it. Why else would the mass media be churning out propaganda about disobedient governments like Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Russia, and China if they didn't need to? They need the citizenry they're charged with manipulating to consent to important geostrategic imperialist maneuvers, or they'll break the hypnotic trance of relentless narrative control. And make no mistake, maintaining narrative control is the single highest priority of establishment power structures because it's absolutely foundational to those structures. This is why the warmonger has been favoring economic warfare over conventional warfare. It's much easier to manufacture support for civilian slaughtering starvation sanctions. It's slower, it's sloppier, and it's surely a lot less fun for the psychopaths in charge. But because the public will consent to economic sanctions far more readily than ground invasions or airstrikes, it's been the favored method in bringing disobedient governments to their knees. That's how important manufacturing consent is. So a bunch of drama around a Saudi oil refinery isn't going to do the trick. The U.S. government is not going to leap into an all-out war, which would inevitably be many times worse than Iraq based on that, because they can't manufacture consent for it right now. All they're trying to do is escalate things a bit further with the goal of eventually getting to a point where Iran either caves to Washington's demands or launches a deadly attack, at which point the U.S. can play victim and the mass media can spend days cheerfully running photos of slain U.S. troops. If that happens, they might gain their consent from the public. If not, we may see them get a little more creative with their crisis initiation. Until then, this is a whole lot of noise and very little signal. which is why I find this current circus uninteresting to write about. It seems like every week now the Trump administration, the U.S. government, is trotting out some new narrative with the help of the mass media, explaining why the Iranian government is evil and must be toppled, and nobody buys it because it's on the other side of the damn planet, and it's always about something silly like oil or broken drones. Their unappealing pestering about this is starting to remind me of really awkward losers who's constantly asking out the prettiest girl in the office over and over again. You just want to pull him aside and say, dude, stop. That's just not into, she's just not into you. Interesting comparison. I think I'm going to stop paying as much attention to these high noise, low signal Trump foreign policy dances and wait until U.S. government foreign policy dances and wait until I actually see a hard, tangible thing to run commentary on instead, particularly with Iran. With the narrative battle still so far from success, it's entirely likely that such an event will not occur until at least 2021, possibly under President Warren, whose warmongering will be cheered on as a historic victory for women everywhere. Until then, just remember, they're trying to manufacture consent because they need it. So don't give it to them.
Wow.
Make sure others don't either.
And I guess women would do a better job, huh?
Yeah, well, I think that what this is a long reflection on the points you made to start with.
Yeah.
That there's a good reason that the political establishment doesn't want Tulsi Gabbard saying things like this during the campaign.
Yeah.
And that's the American war policy remains what it's always been, an attempt to control the world economy, and the U.S. has used neoliberal and neoconservative methods to do it for 40 years, and Trump became president because he criticized it. And people said, yeah, that's right.
I guess we didn't heed Eisenhower's warning.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email me at cgestabrook@gmail.com. We rely on a researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog, Digital Citizen, we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes to this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook and Ed Mandel for the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.